So to briefly introduce Adam, I just learned that I'm the first person that Adam met in the United States when he came here for graduate school. In fact, he came for a graduate school visit. So we almost did our PhD in psychology together, but he ended up doing it at Princeton and doing, I think that was, excuse me, I think that was the right choice. Did very well. He's been at NYU since 2009, I think. Is that right?
That's right.
At NYU Stern School of Business as a professor of marketing. He's written 2 previous books, Drunk Tank Pink, about some of the subtle cues in our environment that can affect how we think and feel and behave. Excuse me. And another one called Irresistible, about technology and how it can be addictive, social media, phones, other digital devices. Really kind of ahead of the curve. His current book, called Anatomy of a Breakthrough, is about what happens when we get stuck, which we all do once in a while. So I'm going to start, Adam, by saying welcome and ask you, what do you mean? Tell us a little bit more about what it means to get stuck and how common is it?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. First of all, thanks, Dave, for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Behavioral Change for Good and Zeitgeist, and for all of the people who have taken some time out of their day. I know we're all busy, so I appreciate you joining us for this. This is something I talk about in the book really early on, is when you say stuck, it's one of those terms that has lots of different meanings for different people. And there are a few ways that I qualify it when I talk about what I'm interested in this book. There are, broadly speaking, 2 kinds of stuck. There's stuck that's within your control to fix or to do something about, and there's stuck that you can't do anything about. For example, speaking of COVID, it's April 2020. We're all stuck in wherever we happen to be living. We can't travel. I wanted to visit my family in Australia. That's not something I could do. That's not psychologically interesting to me or behaviorally interesting. And so it's not what I'm interested in for this book. But in doing some research and running surveys and asking people about their experiences of stuckness, I found that the vast majority of stuckness is actually something that can be worked on. And so I'm interested in these kinds of stuckness that can be worked on and that people can strategize about and try to work their way through. I'm also, I think, more interested in the kind of stuckness that's profound and long lasting, rather than, throughout the day, there are always little frustrations. And I'm not interested in fleeting frustration as much as I am in the kinds of things that plague people, that really feel like major sticking points for them, that they've struggled with for a long period of time. And in doing the survey that I ran, I found that everyone said they were basically stuck in at least one respect. And that the kinds of stuckness that I was talking about, those were the kinds they were experiencing, like financial, work-based, creativity-based, and that they were willing to commit a lot of resources to getting unstuck. And that's really what the book focuses on.
Great. And can you always tell when you're stuck, or is it something you can miss? Like, I didn't realize I was stuck there for years, and I didn't even realize that I'd hit a plateau.
Yeah, so you can further slice down stuckness into all these different categories. There are, again, kind of 2 broad ways of thinking of stuckness. There's stuckness where there's an objective standard that you feel that you can't reach or meet. So if you're a creative, you're a songwriter, you're an artist, you might be a researcher coming up with new research ideas, you need to publish a certain amount. Maybe you're a filmmaker, whatever you might be doing, you have a product that you need to create. And so you have an objective yardstick, and you know that by this date, or there's some other sort of constraint, and by a certain period of time you want to have produced something. Or you're in business and you want to sell a certain amount. So often there are objective standards against which we can measure progress and performance, and being stuck means you're not meeting them. It could be that you're at 0, or it could mean that you just haven't reached what you would consider in a binary sense to be success. There's also stuckness where that's not true, where there is no objective standard, and it's really a subjective state. So you might feel stuck in a job, despite the fact that by all objective standards, you're tremendously successful. And so you hear that from a lot of people. They'll say, I feel unfulfilled. I don't feel that my life has the meaning I'd like it to have, despite the fact that everyone from the outside says, but you've got it all. You've got everything. You're happy and got strong relationships in your life, and you're wealthy, whatever else. And so that kind of stuckness is subjective. I think the thing that unites the subjective and the objective is that when you ask people, they can tell you, yes, I'm stuck. whether or not it's subjective. They'll say either, you know, I'm struggling, I'm trying to write this new film or this book and I can't do it. Or they'll say, you know, my job looks great from the outside, but actually it's not what I want to be doing. And so people are quite capable of introspecting and expressing that they feel stuck in most of the cases that I've explored. It's pretty rare for them not to feel that. Sometimes there's a line from Lost in Translation where Scarlett Johansson's character says, I just have no idea what I want to do. I'm aimless. She says I'm stuck, but she doesn't actually know what that means. And so in that case, it's a bit more amorphous. It's not clear that there's something specific she should be doing. It's just that she doesn't even know what the first step should be. So that's a different species of stuckness that sometimes you hear about as a kind of aimlessness, lost in space kind of thing. And so that's another kind.
I could imagine also, I'm curious what you think of the idea that you are stuck. You're not really making the progress that you would be able to be making, that you're capable of, but you don't necessarily, you go into work every day and you produce a product and it's fine. And so you're content with that, but don't necessarily recognize that there's a whole, right, that you've, as you talk about in the book, that you've plateaued, but there's that plateau is not your limit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are different sort of grades of stuckness, or the gravity of stuckness varies. You know, there can be, I'm extremely proficient at something, but I got stuck at a 9 out of 10, but I really want to be at a 10 out of 10. And I know I have the capacity to do that. I just don't know what to do next to unlock that last little bit, you know, the last 10% or whatever it might be. And then there's, of course, the stuckness that a lot of people feel, which is much earlier on than that. It's not that you're proficient yet, it's that you'd like to be. And so whatever the thing is you're trying to do, you haven't quite reached the 90th or 99th percentile. You're still much earlier on in that journey of progress and capability and capacity. So again, the interesting thing about this is that it's, first of all, it's ubiquitous in the true sense of the word, that everyone says they're stuck in some respect if they spend a few minutes thinking about it. And it does vary dramatically. It can be something grave, like I can't afford a surgery that I need, or something like that, you know, something that's really urgent and pressing. And then sometimes it's just sort of ennui. It's like listening to The National. It's like everything's just fine, but kind of hard. And I feel like I wish life could be better. And, you know, like things just don't feel as good as I'd like them to be. And so it's not grave. It's not like life's teetering on the edge for you, but it feels like something that you'd like to fix.
Right. You could be in 5th gear and you're stuck in 3rd.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this is a question that I hadn't prepared in advance, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on it. It starts to get a little, maybe even psychoanalytic, but you talked about how people say they're stuck and would pay money to get unstuck. And we'll talk about sort of the things that you can do. I mean, the book really is a guide for the things you can do to get unstuck. But do you think people ever like, you talk about anxiety? Is there any sense in which people sometimes are scared of getting unstuck? That being unstuck is sort of feels safer than flying high? You can fall.
Yeah, I think being stuck is often absent of risk. I think it's a state that we get into that you can occupy for many years. And a lot of the people that I interviewed and spoke to said exactly that. You know, I've been in this holding pattern for a long time. And there's definitely a comfort to that if you're someone who's risk averse or you have anxiety. And so as long as it's not the urgent kind of stuck, you know, where things really need to shift, otherwise bad things will happen. A lot of people are comfortable in that state. But most of them say that the feeling, once they express that they're stuck, they say, you know, this doesn't feel good. I know there's another side to this. I can get through this. And if I could get through it, I'd be happier and my life would be richer in some meaningful respect. So yes, I think it's not the path that most people say they want to take, but there is a comfort. And that comfort, I think, especially takes root when you don't interrogate it, when you just let it sit. So even asking people, are you stuck? And in what ways are you stuck? That little audit that people do, and that I pushed them to do when I ran these studies, I think that itself is an unsticking mechanism, just because it forces you to shine a spotlight on whatever things are not quite working. And we don't do that all that often. Those kinds of life audits, unless you're very purposeful about it, we're also busy nose to the grindstone. We don't do that all that often. And so I think that's a useful first step, is to ask are you stuck? And then the second
Mhm.
question is, are you okay with that? And some people might say, honestly, in the list of priorities, it's low down. But most of the people I spoke to said it was pretty urgent.
Mhm. All right. Well, so we'll get to kind of slowing down and asking questions very soon. But when we first, well, several months ago, we chatted about this book. Is around the time when Andy Duke's book Quit came out,
Yeah.
and we spoke to Andy Duke on this in this interview series, I think in January, and the not telling you anything you don't know, but the insight of her book is that we don't quit enough. We should quit more. Quit is a 4-letter word, quite literally. And as I was sort of mentioned to you right before we came on, right, the Kenny Rogers song says you have to know when to hold them and you got to know when to fold them. So your approach seems to be the flip side, the complement, the yin to the yang of quitting. Tell me a little bit about how do you know when, if it is the case, if you agree that sometimes people don't quit enough, how do you know when you shouldn't quit? You should go on. You should persevere. You should get unstuck.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a chapter called Keep Going, which is sort of the opposite of quit, right? That idea. I don't want to presume what Annie would say. I imagine she wouldn't say you should always quit because that makes no sense. And I would never say you should always keep going because that makes no sense.
Right.
And so your question's a good one. How do you know when you should be doing what Annie suggests in her book and when you should do what I'm suggesting, which is that usually maybe just spend a bit more time? I think I also have a chapter called Failing Well, and I think that's a really nice mantra for figuring out whether you should keep going, because in theory, the idea of keep going implies that you haven't reached some sort of threshold that you would consider success, the kind of success that says, obviously, you should keep going. There's a question mark because you haven't reached that. It could be some continuous standard. You want to be at a 10 out of 10 and you're at a 5 out of 10, or it could be just a binary and you just haven't reached whatever threshold it is. But failing well is the idea that failure should be for a purpose. And that intermediate state before you've reached whatever you would consider to be success, when you're deciding whether to continue on or not to continue on, you need to be getting closer to the mark. You need to be converging on whatever outcome it is that you see as desirable. And that's something that people don't explicitly think about all that much as they're moving towards a goal and they're engaged in a long process and trying to decide whether to continue or to quit. So I think that's one thing, is to ask yourself, whether you have objective feedback or not, do you feel as though you're getting closer? And there's a lot of evidence that people who succeed, if you trace the path, there's some research on this, you trace the path, but from being in the failure state to the success state, the gulf between those gets smaller and smaller. So they're getting closer all the time. And it's people who are not getting closer, who either diverge from what they're looking for, or they just never get closer. It's sort of two parallel lines. Those people should quit. And they should quit because clearly they're not getting closer. And it makes total sense when you spell it out that way. The other thing that's interesting, though, is I know Annie suggested that people don't quit enough. There are a lot of cases where I think they quit a little bit too soon. And in some ways, her idea is more counterintuitive, that we don't quit enough, because there's so much in our culture that says keep going, persevere, the work ethic is everything. If you work hard, the good things will come. But I think we've spent enough time now thinking about quitting and pivoting and changing, and we've got so many options that it's very, very easy in a lot of circumstances to quit and to do the next thing. And so I think the message in at least some of the chapters in my book is there's a very good chance, if you're purposeful about it, that spending a little bit more time on what you've already started is worthwhile, assuming that enterprise was worthwhile in the beginning to begin with. And so I sort of unpack why that's so. And I think, again, looking at that convergence, getting closer to success is an important, if I was going to pick one yardstick, that's the thing I would use to determine.
And those yardsticks seem important, right? One of the things Annie talks about is to sort of, in advance, tell yourself, here's my turnaround point, here's my quitting point if I don't make it. And so you're suggesting largely the same thing. And so depending on what that yardstick shows, you should immediately pick up your book and then pick up hers. You're mentioning pivoting here. So pivoting is part of your approach to it, though, too, right? When you say keep going, it doesn't mean keep going along exactly the straight line you've been going on, though, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So, in theory, being stuck means that whatever you've done in the past isn't working. And so there are a number of ways to fix that. One is to quit altogether. And a more subtle approach, and I think a gentler approach, is to pivot, is to make a bit of a change. Sometimes that change could be profound, and sometimes it could be a tweak. And I talk about both of those in the book. I talk about some businesses that are based on small tweaks on existing products, for example, that unlock tremendous value. There's a smartphone company, or not a smartphone, a cell phone company that I really like, that was started in 2007 by a woman named Arlene Harris. And what she saw that the whole tech industry is geared to young people, because the people who make tech products are young historically, and they think about other young consumers.
Right.
And so there's this huge part of the population, the adult population, that's massively overlooked, the even middle-aged to older adult population. And these people also want technology and access to tech, but they want slightly different things. So Harris created a cell phone company that was explicitly for older adults. And she created a phone called the Jitterbug that ended up being sold. That component of her business ended up being sold for $1 billion. And she does this routinely, where she'll say, here's a market, here's a thing that exists. We could tweak it. We could just like kind of put a spin on it and make it suitable for people who have historically in that particular market been undercatered to. And I think that's a brilliant general rule for business, as opposed to saying, if I don't come up with something radically, truly original, I'm going to fail, because that standard is super high. Almost no products are truly radically original, and they don't need to be to succeed.
Right.
So that's the pivot, the sort of subtle pivot. But then there are also cases that are maybe a bit more like what Annie suggests about quitting, where the pivot is like a 180. I mean, it's a pretty serious change. And the case of the origin of Viagra it's often talked about, and I unpack it in some detail in the book, where Viagra was originally a drug that Pfizer's chemists in the UK were making for as part of a whole suite of treatments they were developing for heart disease and for angina, which is a sort of series of painful symptoms that feel like your chest is tightening. And they were testing it on a series of Welsh coal miners. And they asked them, is this working? It was their last ditch attempt, and that the miners were all in this group. They were sitting around and they all said, no, this is not helping. All the symptoms that you're talking about don't seem to be treated. And then as the meeting was ending, the guy who was running the whole thing, who ended up being the sort of figurehead for Viagra and promoted it at the company, said, is there anything else we should know? He asked a series of follow-up questions, open-ended questions. And this guy, one of the coal miners, said, actually, yeah, it had this other symptom that was unexpected. And all the other guys were putting up their hands and saying the same thing. And he ran with that. That's a 180. This is a drug for one thing that becomes a drug for a completely different thing. So yes, the very long answer that I've just given is to say that, yes, it doesn't mean doing the same thing. It means knowing when to make small changes and sometimes when to make wholesale 180s.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on sort of, when your car gets stuck in the mud, but sometimes when you put it in reverse, that's when it gets right out, right? And
exactly.
Forward doesn't work, but it's equally well unstuck.
Right.
So one of the reading the book and the part really where you talk about people slowing down made me think of this quote that I mentioned from Michael Lewis's book about Kahneman and Tversky, where he says that sometimes people can waste years by not wasting hours. And that quote has really stuck with me. When I teach my class, I make a point of sort of emphasizing the idea that we go sort of day to day, minute to hour, minute to minute, and sometimes we don't really slow down and think about what it is we're doing, and that doing that can sort of really narrow our perspective. So you say that sort of when you actually mentioned earlier that before you even know you're stuck, slowing down and thinking about it can be worthwhile. But when you recognize that you're stuck, slowing down is good. Why is that? How does that work?
Yeah, one of the important insights about stuckness is that we're actually kind of poorly designed to deal with it. Humans are not great at dealing with it. And that's especially true in the West. I did some research very early on in my grad school career looking at how we perceive or anticipate change. And I found that people in the West seem to be blindsided by change. They don't anticipate it as readily as people in the East. I looked at people in Korea, Japan, and China in particular, that if you give them, a string of 5 sunny days and say what's coming next, in the West, we say, oh, it's a sunny period and it's going to be more sun. If you tell them a stock has been doing badly, they say it's going to keep tanking. But you get the opposite in East Asian countries. And so they're sort of prepared for change. They say whatever, it's kind of the yin yang Taoism everything that comes up must come down, what goes down must come up, things are changing and shifting constantly. In the West, we're blindsided a little bit by change. And so what happens when things do feel stuck, or when there's a change, is that we panic a little bit. Humans are very, very good at dealing with physical entrapment. We develop, superhuman strength. There are always these stories of people lifting cars off others. And I think that rush of adrenaline that comes from that feeling of being trapped physically is very, very productive. But the feeling of being trapped psychologically is the opposite. It's very unproductive, because it inspires immediate action. It inspires that same rush of adrenaline, and it makes you want to do something. And I think your idea that you just mentioned, of slowing down, of taking a beat, of saving years by wasting a couple of minutes now, or maybe even more than a couple of minutes now, is an antidote to that natural instinctive tendency to just do something, do anything. And again, that's not something we do instinctively at the best of times. But when you're stuck, it's the time when you're least likely to say, all right, let's slow down. Let's take a minute. Let's figure out some strategy. And so not the first three, but the chapters 4 to 6 in the book are all about that sort of emotional response, dialing things down, slowing them down, and how critical that is. Because if you don't do that, you never get to the next parts, which are strategizing and acting. You can't do those two parts successfully if you don't get past the emotional consequences of just rushing and doing everything too fast without really considering it a little bit more carefully.
So you're reminding me that I was going to ask you about the structure of the book and the name of the book. But before we get to that, that'll be my last question. But before we get to that, two quick things. One is slowing down and not immediately acting is what you just said is a good way to go. But you also have a chapter that's called Above All Else, Act. So explain to me a little bit how those two things kind of fit together.
Yeah. So
I'm going to remind people to put their questions in the Q&A. We have several already, and so I'll be moving to those after 2 more questions. Sorry to interrupt.
No, sure. So that's that action above all is the last chapter of the book, and I think when you write this kind of manual it's designed to be fairly practical, much more so than my first 2 books. This is really quite a practical, here are some things you can do. And in fact, the back of the book is 100 ways to get unstuck. So it's very, very concrete. All of that, thinking about how to deal with the emotional consequence of being stuck, how to strategize, that's all in the service ultimately of action. What I write about when I say action above all, the idea that you should just act, is that by definition, if you're acting, you're not stuck. At least you're not fixed where you are. And so I talk about Jeff Tweedy, the front man from Wilco, who is also a writer. He writes books as well, a very productive Renaissance guy who's talked a lot about the process of he calls it pouring out. I love the idea that these creative ideas are sort of liquid. And he talks about pouring out his creative ideas. And he says that he spends a certain period of time at the beginning of any creative period purposely pouring out bad ideas. And sometimes he actually cultivates badness in his ideas. He wants ideas that are not good, that are not usable, because that unlocks something. It's sort of if you think about the product being subterranean, the good stuff is subterranean. You've got to get there and you've got to dig the bad stuff out. So he thinks of that initial pouring out of the bad ideas as liberating the good ones. And I think that's what I was suggesting about action above all. So, but that could be part of the strategy that comes from pausing. You could say to yourself, hey, I'm going to spend the first hour of the day, this is very strategic, the first hour of the day is for pouring out the bad ideas. I'm going to think, what's the worst possible way that I could start this chapter of my book? Or what's the worst movie I could write a script for? What's the worst painting I could paint? And maybe do it, actually paint the thing. And then what's left over is the good stuff. It shows you what works and what doesn't. Also, paradoxically, often doing what you think is the worst has bits that are really productive and good and different from the way you normally think about things. And so he talks as well about the fact that by cultivating bad products, sometimes there are these kind of little flecks of gold in there, and you need to find them, and you eliminate them by using that technique.
Right. You realize that you are doing some of the things that you actually consider to be terrible ideas.
Exactly.
Another musician you mentioned, Paul Simon, in there, which to me reminded me, the last chapter in your book is really unusual but great. Paul Simon's got the book 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, and you got 100 ways to get unstuck. I find that's a guide that I'm going to print out and sort of keep around separate from the book. I've changed my screen. I got to find the question. So before we get to the question of anatomy, which I want to end with, there's one thing. There's a lot of great stuff in this book, and so there's 100. You're right. I just mentioned the 100 things. We've been through maybe 5 of them, and we're not. You're gonna have to read the book to get all these nuggets. But one of the things that you mentioned that really stuck with me on crowdsourcing, on getting input from other people, is that it's better. You're better off adding people to your team, even if they're incompetent. And that obviously sounds like a pretty foolish move. Why would you want to add an incompetent person to your team? But you say even that helps. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, there are three ways to think about people that you put on a team. There are people who are consistent with what the team's trying to do. You're all moving in the same direction. You're highly correlated in your values, attitudes, backgrounds, and so on. And so you maybe studied the same things. You have the same disciplinary grounding, all of that sort of stuff. And that's great. Teams should probably be comprised to a large extent of that kind of simpatico. Then there are people who are known as non-redundant. These are people who are sort of neutral and orthogonal or different from the other people on the team. It's not that they clash in any way, they're just different. And so very often you'll see, like a lot of the dominant hedge funds in the US have done this, and consulting management firms do it as well, where they'll say, let's find the person who is the #1 Russian literature student at a university, and then let's find someone who's the #1 organic chemistry student, and bring these people in who are really bright. They have a sort of general capacity, but they're all very different in terms of what they do. So that's orthogonality, and there's value in that. The third one that you've just mentioned is, it's not so much just pure incompetence, but it's agents of chaos. It's people, they could be very competent, but they are black sheep. And so Pixar is well known for doing this, that some of the producers, Brad Bird is one who's famous for this, and they've created Academy Award-winning films doing this. They will put together a team, and then they'll say, okay, this team thinks that animation is critical. It's, the first thing we have to do is have the best animation. We got to make sure that the hair on the characters looks real and the water looks like water, and they'll spend days, hours, months, forever working on that. But then he'll bring someone in who says, actually, that's nonsense. Like, that's ridiculous. We don't need to worry about that. All people care about is the narrative. And I'm going to be the agent of chaos. You're going to throw me into the mix, and I'm going to change the way everyone thinks in 2 ways, in 2 senses. One sense is, I will bring content that's different. So the actual content of my ideas, the substance of the ideas will be different. But the second thing is, I'm going to change the way people think. So it's not just that I tell you things you didn't know before, but I show you a new way of kind of strategically moving through the process of making whatever the film might be. And there's even this really interesting study where people are put into groups and asked to solve problems, where they are given help from an AI bot, a little bit like kind of a ChatGPT kind of thing. And the bot is either programmed to be helpful or to be an agent of chaos. And the teams do better when the bot is an agent of chaos, because it makes them think differently, divergently, creatively. And so I think there's something really interesting there, that element of counterintuitive complexity and difficulty and chaos is quite valuable in these contexts for getting unstuck.
So you shouldn't go out and look for incompetent people, but you should keep your eye out and be open to people who just think radically differently. Yeah,
so capable agents of chaos. I think you don't want just sheer incompetence, but it basically means sometimes competence isn't the only thing you should be looking for.
It's certainly not by the standards that the narrow standards that you have.
Exactly.
So before I go to the questions, I wanted to, so the book is not Get Unstuck or How to Have a Breakthrough. It's called The Anatomy of a Breakthrough. So walk us through sort of how that anatomy unfolds and why you decided to write the book that way.
Yeah, so there are 4 sections of the book. They have, each has an H, as it's an H word that describes the section. So there are 12 chapters of 12 chapters with three chapter sections. The first section is called Help, and it's basically just an attempt to dispel, I think, a lot of the myths that surround stuckness and what it is to be stuck and how you find breakthroughs. And so that's really just, that's more like, I guess, my first 2 books, which was saying, here's the research, here's what we know, here are some examples, here are some people in the real world who've really succeeded, and what can we learn from them? And so that's the first 3 chapters. The next 3 sections are heart, which is deals with the emotional consequence of getting stuck, which we described, this anxiety, the idea of slowing down so that you can kind of catch your breath. There are stories about Andre Agassi doing this and Lionel Messi, soccer and tennis stars doing this sort of thing. The next section is on, so it's heart, and then head, which is the strategies you can use, the ways to think about how to be creative and pivoting and things like that, and consulting other people for advice, which we just talked about, and agents of chaos and so on. And then the last section is on habit, the actual actions you can take. So it's help, heart, head, and habit. And that's sort of the anatomy. And since those are anatomical terms, except for help, I guess, that's the idea that getting unstuck is a lot like diagnosing a problem in a body, in a human body or in an animal, and there is a sort of roadmap. And in fact, there's a story of a guy who's known as the real world Dr. House, who has this way of dealing with the problems that make other doctors feel stuck, and how he uses it's essentially a meta version of what I'm describing here. He has this algorithm that is the anatomy of getting unstuck as a diagnostician.
So those are my questions. We have a set of questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with the most upvoted question, which comes from an anonymous attendee. And he or she asks, isn't life in general just not as interesting as we want it to be? It seems we just want to get to the next peak, and life just isn't like that. So what's the difference between being stuck and just not getting to that excitement peak?
Yeah, so that's a subjective question, right? So there are a lot of people who I think accept that life isn't constantly 100 out of 100, 10 out of 10. One problem, and this actually goes back to my last book, is that what you're exposed to online and in other people's lives is the very cream of the crop. It's the 1% of experiences that are the very best. Like I don't share bits of I don't really share bits of my life on social media much anyway, but most people don't tell you about the mundane stuff that's going on in their lives. So you see that top 1% of everyone's top 1% lives, and you think, well, I know the muddiness and the messiness of my own life, and actually it doesn't compare to that. And so that's a sort of problematic dynamic. Now you can come to the realization that actually that's fine. That's how life is, that actually those people also have messiness that they're just not sharing. Right. Or you can say, this makes me feel stuck and I need to do something about it. I think different people are looking for very different things. What you've described in this question is measuring life and the success of life according to these kinds of peaks of maybe elation or peak experiences that bring meaning. And I think that's totally valid. There are also people who say, I know I've lived a good life if my life is calm and I'm contented and I have meaning and I have these long-term projects that are fruitful and so on, which is a very different definition. And so stuckness in that sense really depends on your definition of what it is to live a good life and what your standards are. So I don't think there's like a one size fits all response to that. If you're measuring it according to peak experiences and you're not having enough of them, I actually think it's among the stucknesses that I've heard of from people, that's not the most complicated one to solve, because all you've really got to do is to kind of build those in, fashion them into your life, decide that once a month is going to be my peak day or something like that, and just sort of schedule time for these experiences. Do something different that you've never done before once a week or once every 2 weeks or once a month, depending on how much time you have. But that is an interesting point, that sometimes it doesn't rise to the level of being stuck. It's below that. And that's just a question of how you interpret it subjectively.
So we had a question sort of along the desire for sort of elation strikes me as this one dimension to clarify. You talked before about east-west differences. That might not be a universal desire, but Ricardo Sestarelli asks, along the lines of the demographics question and your anecdote of East versus West, are there other proxies that determine how likely someone is to get stuck? And he mentions gender, education, level, career. Is there something about people that tends to get them stuck?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that seems, I'll just talk about one of them because I think this is a really interesting one, and it's a big sort of feature of our culture, which is fetishizing goals and goal pursuit, and the idea that life is a series of goals. I think it's a really unhelpful way to think about living your life, and the unhelpful roadmap to live by. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have things that you aim for, but if you couch your actions and your life in terms of goals, you essentially exist perennially in a failure state where there's a goal, you're striving for that goal. Until you reach that goal, in a binary sense, you've failed, or you are currently failing. When you reach that goal, here's the thing: if reaching that goal made you enduringly happy, that might be worthwhile. But there's a lot of evidence that actually even people who break world records, which should be the peak of elation and should lead to enduring well-being, they have this incredible crisis where they reach the goal and they're like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do next. And there's an aimlessness that comes from that. In fact, you get stuck.
That after tenure as well.
Yes, after tenure as well. It's the same thing. You know, there's that thing you've been thinking about as the goal. And so I think a more sort of helpful way of doing things is instead of being a goal person, is to be a systems person. There are a few people who've written about this, and I think it's really smart. And it's the idea that instead of saying, my goal is to write a book of 100,000 words, you should have a system, which is that every day I'm going to wake up and I'm going to spend 4 hours before 1 p.m. writing. And, you might have some subsystems that tell you what that 4-hour period should look like. But that way, success is sort of doing that. It's doing the 4 hours every day. And so every day could be considered a success on the way to what ultimately ends up being the goal, but you just don't couch your life that way. And so I think people who fetishize goals in general are less happy and healthy psychologically than those who don't see life through that lens.
So I don't know if you caught this or if people in the audience caught this, but Giannis Antetokounmpo of the Milwaukee Bucks just got eliminated from the playoffs. And they asked him this question, right? Like, you got eliminated, you're the number one team in the league, you got eliminated in 5 games in the first round of the playoffs. Was that a failure? And he said, that's a stupid question.
Yeah.
He said Michael Jordan played 15 years and won 6 championships. Was every other season a failure? That's the kind of thinking you're referring to here.
Yeah, that's funny. I don't post that much on social media. I just posted that video because I thought it was the perfect illustration of failing well, as I described it. Because Giannis talks about the fact that he says something like, Michael Jordan won 6 championships with the Bulls, but he played for 20 years. Does that mean 14 years were failures? And he said, obviously, that's a ridiculous way to think of what those 14 years represented to Jordan and in general, what they represent to fans and to the team. And I think that's so wise because, as you say, Dave, it's that kind of binary mentality that if only one team is going to be the champion each year, what does that mean for the enterprise of playing and not winning championships year after year? Not everyone's going to be Bill Russell winning 11 championships or whatever. Right. So it's I think it's an incredibly mature way of looking at the world, and I think a way of looking at the world that will bring greater well-being over time.
So I don't have a lot of time left. I had 2 questions that were quite different, but in some ways asked you to apply this to 2 different outcomes. One was to relationships, getting unstuck with toxic relationships. That's Nader Bakar. And Louise Booth asked about organizations. Can an organization get stuck? And I realize that with 3 minutes to go, that's a lot to throw at you to answer all at once. But I'm going to do it anyway and see how you do.
Sure. Yeah, no, I do talk about both of those contexts. In fact, that idea of assembling teams is very organizational in flavor. And I do talk a lot about organizations and what organizations can do. I talk in the book a little bit about exploration and the importance of exploration, which it turns out when you have an organization with multiple people, it's easier to explore. And by explore, I mean adopting a kind of experimental mindset where the orthodoxies of the day, the way the herd tends to behave, are questioned routinely and in a very algorithmic way. And so you say, even things like the 5-day, 8-hour day, 8 hours per day work week of 40 hours, let's question that. And so now there's been all this research saying, hey, 4-day work weeks are better in certain respects. I did some research as an undergrad suggesting that that 3-day work weeks are even better. You have a very long day, 13-hour day, but do that. It's the same across the week, but it turns out that workers are in a better position. So yes, I talk about that in the book. Certainly there are organizational applications. I do talk a little bit about relationships as well. You mentioned specifically toxic relationships. If it's a toxic relationship that can be, this is one time when maybe getting unstuck is about quitting, is about doing what Annie would suggest, what Annie Duke would suggest. And so if you can quit that, obviously that sounds, based on the term toxic, it sounds like it's in the name. That's probably not very good for you. But obviously there are toxic relationships that are not optional. And that might be because the relationship is within a family, or it's a workplace where you can't escape. And I do talk about some ideas that are more relationship based. But also the very first question is, what does it mean to be stuck? To some extent, some of those relationships, because they're not optional, there's not all that much you can do about them. You can reframe them, you can change the dynamic. But if you can't make major changes, maybe there's a power differential, or it's, for other reasons, you're constrained in how much you can do. That's one of those situations where maybe your ability to intervene is modest. And I do talk about that as well in the book.
Sorry, you also raised this point when we talked about toxic relationships and when it might be a good idea to quit, is that being stuck depends, it seems, in a sense, how you frame the stuckness. So you frame the stuckness of I'm stuck in this relationship versus I'm stuck in my romantic life.
Right.
With a broader frame, you can see this is, yes, I'm quitting this particular relationship, but I'm getting unstuck in my broader relationships. I'm spending way too much time with this friend, but that's allowing me to spend more time with other new people. And so that's a thought, just to not overly narrowly frame your stuckness.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are a lot of things that we do in life that we don't rate as a 10 out of 10. We've heard this idea that not everything is elation. That's also true about relationships, and it's true about just if you section the hours of the day, it's not going to be 24 hours of bliss every single day for the rest of your life. That's just not how life works. And so I think if you can de-emphasize the stuff that doesn't make you happy, that detracts from your welfare, just accept that some things are going to be at a 0 or a +1 or a +2 on a scale of hedonic welfare. Like they're kind of neutral, maybe slightly positive. And then try to cultivate those 10s and 9s and 8s if that's what you want. Travel a little bit more. Spend your money on things that are going to bring you whatever you define as, the things that bring you that kind of elation. For a lot of people, I know younger people in particular, that's travel. But
well, Adam, this hour has been a 10 out of 10 for me. Thanks so much for sharing this with us. Go out and get the book. There's a lot more in there. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. And good luck on the book launch. It's coming up May 16th. I think there's also Cassie will have put the information in chat, but there's a discount, I believe, on Barnes & Noble to get various versions of it. I'll remind you that if you're here now, you're already registered for our last official webinar of the season, which is Hal Hirschfield's Your Future Self, which is coming up in 2 weeks. On May 12th. And we're also going to be having a bonus episode 2 weeks later on May 26th. I'll be sending out registration details for that. But that's Vanessa Patrick, who wrote The Power of Saying No. She will be interviewed by Zoe Chance. So we look forward to seeing you for both of that. Thank you again, Adam. Wonderful book. Really enjoyed reading it. I think being stuck is ubiquitous, and having this as a guide is enormously helpful. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.